floor is yours.
Thanks, Bosco. Let me share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, so I only have 15 minutes, so I'm just going to get right to it. My purpose today is just to provide a basic understanding of the approach in my book, African Hermeneutics. And I hope to cover the following, just basic understanding of reading the Bible in Africa. Do we need contextual hermeneutics? A motivation for Afrocentric approaches, a motivation for the four-legged stool approach, which is what I call my approach, its theoretical framework, and then just give a brief explanation of that and maybe perhaps get to some of the strengths if we have time. But before I talk about my own approach, I want just to give some background about Afrocentric approaches in general. We have a lot of this on our website if you've gone to that website. For one, hermeneutics is not new to Africa. I think we all would agree with that, because African literature demonstrates that there are rules to interpret stories, poetry, proverbs, riddles, and songs that make understanding possible. So where the Bible is concerned, history records that interpretation of the Bible was being done by Africans almost 2,000 years ago. And of course, we can have a debate about what that means, but they were located in North Africa. Some of the most important early interpreters of the Bible include church fathers like Origen and Augustine in North Africa. That's not the point of my presentation today, so I'm not going to go into a lot about that. Then more recently, in the last century, missionaries reintroduced biblical hermeneutics into Africa, inevitably bringing with them their cultural baggage from their Western context. Because colonization was also taking place at the same time, some Africans have objected to Western approaches, preferring instead to decolonize hermeneutics, something like what Bosco was talking about a little earlier. Consequently, biblical hermeneutics in Africa generally tends to be liberational and against the colonial missionary enterprise. Now, one of the things we need to recognize is that African biblical hermeneutics is not limited to academic study or even to written forms of interpretation, but it also includes oral hermeneutical reflection. And much of it is done by ordinary Christians or church leaders at the grassroots level, for example, in worship, in prayer, and in preaching. It also tends to be very functional, Afrocentric approaches, that is. In other words, how does a text speak to concrete contextual realities being experienced by the African people? As West notes, the Bible is not only a text of power, it's also a tactile object of power. And so we take the words in it and the object itself very seriously. So how Africans approach the discipline of biblical hermeneutics may look a little different from that from the West. It includes both the theories as well as the general principles and methods that you find in practices of interpretation, for instance, like the AIC hermeneutics and Pentecostal hermeneutics. So I think that amongst many African scholars, there is now the general consensus that we need to move away from the Western approaches that have been imposed on us because they promote a foreign way of reading the Bible that introduces a double hermeneutical gap. I think that's the general impetus or motivation behind Afrocentric approaches in general and my approach as well. So the question is, do we really need contextual hermeneutics? People ask me this all the time. Do contextual readings have value? I think that we need to recognize that with advances in the study of hermeneutics, there's the recognition of that two-sided nature of historical conditioning. Thistleton, a Western author, points out the interpreter also stands in a given historical context and tradition, and the two are in constant engagement. So let's take the example of the tortoise and the hare. I hope that this is common in your part of the world. It's common in many parts of the world. Tortoise challenges hare to a race, and of course, nobody expects him to win. And what Tortoise does, he recruits his relatives, places them strategically along the path of the race, and then each one jumps out of the bush ahead of hare in sequence as the one behind him hides to avoid being seen. So at the end of the race, as we might expect, Tortoise is the undisputed winner. But without knowing which rules to apply or how to read, one might misunderstand this story to be a criticism of Tortoise's deception. But is it? What this story actually teaches is that cooperation is necessary in society. It's also a story that emphasizes the importance of honor in an honor-shame culture. It is, as Bukele notes, an appeal to a higher moral ethic. And that ethic is that a family must work together in unity to see that disgrace never comes to it. Our contextual situatedness leads us to different ways of reading this story. So what I'm proposing today is that contextual rereadings are valid because they reveal insights we might not otherwise see, and they do that by exposing our blind spots. Like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, different contextual readings contribute to form a more complete picture of the biblical text. So what was my motivation for developing this? I think it's important that you understand that, so that you understand where I'm coming from. The first was the lack of contextual resources available to my students. So this was really just geared for my students. I realized that as my students learned how to interpret the Bible, they seemed unable to connect the world of the text and their own world. So both interpretation and application were often flawed. A second reason was the rapid growth of the church in the global south, and particularly in Africa. A Pew Research says by 2018, Africa had the largest number of Christians in the world. A more recent Pew Research predicts that 4 out of 10 Christians will live in Africa by 2060. So I realized that our students needed resources that they could use with benefit if they were to be of help in providing a solid biblical foundation for the church in Africa. The third reason was a troubling dichotomy in the church alongside the growth. I don't want to demonize Africa, but this dichotomy manifests itself in several very negative ways. The most serious is neo-Pentecostalism and its attendant doctrines, with the major one being the prosperity, health, and wealth gospel. Of course, I realize this is not just an African problem, but there's a proliferation of false prophets and of mighty men and women of God offering healings, miracles, and wealth, and just their congregants are so gullible, they fall for it. Syncretism is also a major challenge. Traditional practices such as witchcraft, ancestor worship or veneration, polygamy, they're actually on the increase, with a growing group of Christians in Africa now rejecting Christianity altogether. A good example is the tribe I come from. There is a very big move now to get rid of Christianity at all costs. And then the fourth reason was that I felt we were missing something in the interpretation of the Bible, given that Christianity has been on the continent for more than a century. That is when you think about the modern missionary movement. So I concluded that foreign methods were the problem, as they introduced a double hermeneutical gap, which made the text seem even more remote from our African context. So this gap occurs when a reader is forced to confront at least two cultures in the process of interpretation. African readers face the challenge of first understanding the assumptions behind Western methods before dealing with those in the biblical texts. So that's what motivated me. So let me just explain my method. I call it the four-legged stool. So why this metaphor? It's because a stool is a familiar object in Africa, both in the past and even in the present. And just as a good stool is stable and supports our weight, so this hermeneutical stool, I believe, is one we can put our weight on, confident that it provides a stable or accurate interpretation of the biblical text. It has 5 steps, and while those 5 steps are distinctly separate for purposes of analysis, it's understood that there is overlap between them, as each step must necessarily enhance the others, much like the hermeneutical spiral that we have in Western hermeneutics. So this was my theoretical framework as I developed this approach. First of all, this is an intercultural model that encourages a constructive dialogue between the African context and the biblical context. Paul's Areopagus speech in Acts 17 serves as a model in that speech, Paul interrogates and confronts the worldviews of the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, and he also uses their cultural resources in that speech. It's also based on the concept of moving from the known to the unknown. So it moves directly from theories, methods, and categories that are familiar in the African world into the more unfamiliar world of the Bible without taking a detour through any foreign methods. So it recognizes that parallels between biblical and African cultures and worldviews can be used as bridges because they're so close. So they can be used as bridges to promote understanding, internalization, and application of the biblical text. It's also based on the recognition of assumptions. It's understood that because readers approach the text from their contextual situatedness, they, as well as the methods they use, come with their assumptions. So these aid us in reading the text, but we sometimes import these assumptions into the text with negative results. In Africa in general, theological educators often end up imposing Western assumptions on our students, which makes understanding more complicated. At the same time, we fail to interrogate the assumptions our students bring to the text from their various backgrounds. It's also based on, it also recognizes that the African cultures, both material and non-material, are a significant tool for the interpretive process. This includes the techniques that enable us to interpret the various genres of African literature, both oral as well as post-colonial, but it goes a little bit further by considering the worldviews represented by the reader. These are valid. They form an essential interpretive bridge, as I noted earlier about assumptions. As African readers of the biblical text, we must rediscover our cultures and worldviews and apply them in our hermeneutics, but we must also be careful to interrogate our assumptions so as not to displace biblical revelation. I believe that our conclusions must be in alignment with the biblical meta-narrative. This is also a method that is also similar to some Western methods in that it recognizes the value of the theological, literary, and historical context of the text. So it strives to provide a balanced reading of texts and therefore complements rather than replaces Western methods. While there may be some overlap with categories traditionally ascribed to Western methods, the conceptualizations of these categories is based on African assumptions. And then finally, it has a three-way dialogue. I think effective hermeneutics requires a three-way dialogue between the world behind the text, the world of the text, and the world in front of the text. So this approach doesn't collapse these three worlds like some approaches do. All three stand in a context that must be interrogated. And for me, the two horizons of meaning and significance are kept distinct. Even with the influence of Western education, Africans generally tend to have a more holistic approach to life, which means that from the moment an African reader begins to interact with a text, he or she is already deriving meaning and significance simultaneously, collapsing the worlds behind, of, and in front of the text, and merging the two horizons of what it meant to the original readers and what it means to us. So this approach makes that distinction between meaning as intended for the original readers and significance as applied to the modern reader. So I'm almost out of time now, so I'll just talk about the method itself. If my, The first leg is parallels to the African context. That's where I begin. So I begin with my own context. It's to consciously identify and interrogate our own context and discover the points of contact and difference between it and the biblical context. So in this way, I believe we can identify cues that will allow for a more accurate interpretation of the text through a process of comparing the two contexts and analyzing the findings. So this leg is a bridge between the two contexts that allows us to begin to understand the biblical text from a familiar position, so from the known to the unknown, and interrogate our assumptions so that we can begin to correct any faulty assumptions that may hinder the interpretive process. So for instance, in a text that has exorcisms or power encounters, or even social-cultural issues of gender or ethnicity, an African reader can profitably use their own assumptions about external reality and anthropology to form a bridge with the text. It therefore defines the scope or the boundaries within which meaning may be sought, because of course, meaning is not a pinpoint. The second leg is the theological context. So while the African approach is holistic, it's nevertheless primarily undergirded by spiritual concerns. So this implies that in Africa, biblical hermeneutics is inseparable from theological reflection, because the emphasis is generally to address contextual realities within our societies. Remember, I said Afrocentric approaches tend to be functional. So because of this orientation to life, an understanding of the biblical theological emphasis of the text provides the foundational data for the reader, orienting his or her approach to the interpretation of the text. it's important to recognize that while the Bible can be regarded as literature, it's primarily a spiritual document. And so key to the interpretive process is a correct understanding of the biblical theological emphases and how these are expressed within the structural framework of the parts as well as the whole. So for instance, I'm sure as we all know, John and Mark would have different emphases, and these affect how we interpret the text. So the third leg is the literary context. And here, this will define the boundaries of meaning, in that the intended meaning of any passage is the meaning that is consistent with the sense of the literary context in which it occurs, as Klein, Blomberg, and Hubbard say in their book. So here one identifies the genre, the literary techniques, the language, including lexical and syntactical issues, and the progression of the text as it unfolds, as well as in relation to surrounding text. So depending on the genre, there are certain additional rules that apply from African literature. So for instance, in analyzing a narrative text, one would distinguish between one, the world of the agents of communication, which include the narrator and the listener, and two, the world of the story itself, which includes the plot, the spatial and temporal settings, the literary devices, such as alternation between narration and dialogue, contrastive dialogue, editorial comments, so on and so forth, and characterization. So this fourth leg enhances or reinforces or corrects the conclusions arrived at so far, because application is always coming to mind as soon as one reads the text. So this helps to ground the application in genuine real facts. So the fourth leg is the historical context. So in addition to the theological and literary concerns, Africans try to make sense of our lives in relation to the historical and cultural context in which events occur. And African literature is no different. This means that behind the text issues provide crucial data in the interpretive process. So any interpretation must consider these factors because of the cultural and temporal distance between us and the text. And this has been recognized by Western hermeneutics for a long time. So I think that if the authorial intent and determinacy of meaning within those boundaries are to be taken seriously, we must enter into the world of the author and allow his world to provide the parameters that guide our understanding. In other words, we must respect the otherness or the alterity of the text. So if we think about Jesus' interaction with the woman of Samaria in John 4, we have to enter into their social and religious worlds for us to grasp the implications of the story. And the final aspect of this approach is the seed, which is the application. The four legs reveal the probable meaning as it was intended for the original listeners. That's my meaning significance distinction. But the seat is now where we derive significance for ourselves. So one implication of this distinction is that the listeners cannot impose their assumptions on the story or make it mean whatever they want it to mean in a postmodernist kind of way. So even though we become part of the story, we don't make the story in our image, but we allow it to guide us to its true shape and form. So significance now is the application to the context of the listener, expressed in terms that we understand in our own African society. So this last step is only a confirmation of the tentative application of the text as uncovered in the legs above. So here we must deculturalize the message from the cultural form in which it is communicated, and then we must reculturalize it in an African form. We also have to distinguish between transcontextual and culture-bound truths. So for instance, in this step, if you consider the command to honor your father and mother, at least one aspect of this for the original audience would be obedience to one's parents. This would include entering into arranged marriages. In our own African context, obedience would still be a way to honor one's parents, but unless one comes from a more traditional setup, one is not bound to an arranged marriage. Eloping would, however, be considered to be dishonoring one's parents. So as I conclude, I think that this method has certain strengths, as I've used it with my students and some of my colleagues. It allows the text to speak into African contextual realities. That means then that it becomes a relevant text that allows us to engage in a constructive dialogue, and it confronts us where it matters. So because it pays attention to the African context, application is more relevant. If you remember, you entered in with your context, and so you're already looking for answers. It also confronts dichotomy and syncretism by allowing for dialogue between the African and biblical cultures and worldviews, thus exposing wrong doctrine and practice. It acknowledges the multidimensional or the global character of Christian faith. This is because it allows fresh insights from the biblical text. I think it provides a different way of reading that complements Western and other reading. And 4, it includes ordinary readers. So rather than relegate hermeneutics to the domain of academics or intellectuals, it makes it possible for ordinary readers to participate actively in Bible translation. 5, it encourages transformation of society. This is because it promotes understanding and internalization of biblical truths within our own African context. So the potential for transformation of society is increased. 6, it promotes understanding and interrogation of African contexts and awareness of our religious spaces. And this is very important because Africa is very pluralistic and religious spaces are quite porous, which is why syncretism is so prevalent. And then 7th, and then perhaps most importantly, it helps redefine African Christian identity. Identity is core to our human existence. We operate on the basis of our identities, but our identity markers should not be decided for us by our African traditional religions, by our cultures, or even our African worldviews. So this approach allows for a redefinition of identity based on biblical criteria. So in conclusion, as I come to the end, African hermeneutics and this method that I have talked about, it recognizes that the Bible speaks powerfully into the present. It's also not a replacement of Western methods, and I think I need to emphasize that, but complementary. And I think that it shows us that the African voice is a vital contribution to the global theological conversation. Thank you.